Hi, everyone. Sorry for the delay. We were trying to get some new video components to load, and they're not working. So there we are. Welcome to Resistance Live. It's the 3rd of September, 2025, and I am Elizabeth Cronise McLaughlin, former Wall Street and human rights lawyer, lifelong activist, currently somebody who consults with all sorts of progressive leaders on how to make the biggest change you can right now. All right. So the Epstein victims press conference ended about a half an hour ago now. I tuned in for part of it. It was extremely hard to watch. I know that will come as no surprise to anyone who is a survivor themselves or anybody who actually cares about other human beings. It was rough, like really rough, and particularly rough because there were victims there who had never before appeared publicly, whose names we have never heard, including a victim who was trafficked by Jeffrey Epstein after Alex Acosta cut that deal with him that essentially prevented him from doing hard time for all of the crimes against girls and women that we knew about, or that Acosta knew about, that the feds knew about in advance of 2009. And so obviously, if officials had done their job the first time around, that woman and many others would not have been trafficked thereafter. Very tough to watch. Very tough to watch. Now, in terms of what happens next, we have these survivors and their lawyers who were present today going around the Hill today advocating for the release of the files. Something curious has happened now that Congress is back in session. You will all remember that Mike Johnson released the House of Representatives days early to avoid a vote on the Epstein files in August. The House is now back in session. Trump apparently signaled to the House GOP that if they supported a request to release the Epstein files, it would be considered an act of war. And yet, Thomas Massie, of all people, is out front again this morning demanding a full release of the Epstein files. And of course, he has with him the entire Democratic Party. So we're going to see what happens with this. But I will say that it was very difficult to watch these survivors speak and not think about the dire consequences, not just to them, but to the hundreds and hundreds of survivors that we don't yet know about and whose names and faces we may never know, who have never received justice. And the only other thing that I will say about this at this point is that we did have some breaking news this morning that these survivors, particularly the ones who have been brave enough to step forward, are going to be making their own list of individuals who are engaged in abuse in cahoots with Jeffrey Epstein. Now, I have to warn everybody about this. This does not mean that a complete list of people is going to be released, right? That information, again, I'm going to repeat this, is in the Epstein files. We know that something like 11,000 photographs and videos were seized from Epstein's residences, because there were multiple residences searched. We know that that evidence is in the possession of the DOJ. The fact that we have not yet seen those files raises real question marks. Last night, the House, who had already received a tranche of files from the DOJ, released most of what they had already received because it was already in the public domain. There were no big revelations in there. Not surprisingly, this is consistent with what we know to be an ongoing cover-up. And so while it is helpful that survivors are making their own list, what we still really need is the release of the files. And again, this is something that everybody should be advocating for. It's an easy ask. You can make your phone calls. Congress is back in session. It's time for these files to be released. Okay. Yesterday, we had a broadcast on Trump's ailing health. He's still not in great shape, but he did have a press conference yesterday about moving the headquarters of Space Force, as was signaled when we were on the air yesterday, from Colorado to Alabama. And that's what that was apparently about. His entire press conference was still a gobbledygook word salad. But one of the things that I would just like to point out here is that they knew that the Epstein victims press conference and rally was happening this morning. They knew that there was going to be a lot of activity on the Hill about this today. And so in addition to the kind of necessary proof of life that everybody was asking for, We also are in a situation now where I think they were trying to divert attention. This is one of those rare instances when I actually do think that whole thing was a distraction, because not everything is a distraction. And in fact, most things aren't a distraction. They're just fascism. So that one was a little bit weird. And again, I do think it's linked to the Epstein events that are happening today. Okay. We have to talk about Chicago because we learned yesterday afternoon that the Texas National Guard is mobilizing now on the outskirts of Chicago to, as has been signaled, invade Chicago on Mexican Independence Day, which is in about 2 weeks, for purposes of essentially raiding celebratory events. And Governor Pritzker gave another press conference yesterday where he advised citizens of Chicago to film things, to be present, to keep their neighbors safe, to be prepared, and also really said it like it was, right? Made no bones about the fact that this is an invasion seeking to terrorize people, that it has no legitimate basis, that it's not on the basis of crime, that it's not on the basis of anything else, that it has not been requested, that it is literally just an attempt to terrorize people into submission. I'm still very pleased with what Pritzker is doing. However, I want to raise one key issue about this particular invasion that differs from the rationales that were used in Los Angeles, that also differs from what's happening in DC. As we discussed yesterday, there was a ruling yesterday that found that Trump's invocation of a state of emergency, essentially, to mobilize the National Guard and the Marines into Los Angeles was illegal. And so the provision that is now being invoked to mobilize the Texas National Guard into Chicago keeps the National Guard of Texas under the control of Governor Abbott. Okay. This is insane. I just have to point this out. Completely crazy. It essentially makes what's happening not just equivalent to, but actually the invasion of another state by the Texas National Guard. Not only is this contrary to the principles of our Constitution, which give a degree of sovereignty to each state by its state's governor, that state gets to make decisions about what's happening inside the state through the governor and elected officials, but also it is tantamount to an act of war. And I said last night on Blue Sky that one of the things that I haven't liked a lot about the last 9 years is the use of the term civil war getting tossed around like nobody's business. I have described what has happened as an information war or a cold war through cyber ops, disinformation, propaganda, and the like. This is something entirely different. And it really is, unlike the rationales that have been invoked in other places, a true attempt by one state at the behest of our fascist president to invade another. Nobody knows exactly where this is going to end. I will say that it is very clear that community organizers in Chicago have been meeting in anticipation of what's to come. They are preparing to keep their own community safe. They are incredibly well organized from what I have seen so far. And in fact, one of the things that is happening, which is really good to see, is the flip of this place of panic and fear into a place of true resistance and disruption of what's to come. Because I don't think there's any debate at this point that this has to be stopped, and that essentially if the invasion of Chicago is unsuccessful, that will really throw sand in the gears of Trump's attempts to do this elsewhere. It is really important that this particular effort is stalled in its tracks. So we will have to see what is happening next in this, because there's a run-up right now. This is not happening instantly. There is a run-up. There will be court actions filed. There are efforts underway already for organizers to prepare for this. And of course, Chicago is not the only place that Trump has threatened. All that said, there are very serious questions about the legal basis for this and what it means. And I know that they're doing this to evade the argument that they lost yesterday about the reason for the rollout in Los Angeles. They're doing it to try to find another legal justification, but they don't have one. And so again, prepare yourselves. This is not going to be pretty. And I also just have to say one other thing about this. If you are not an organizer on the ground in Chicago, please don't take to social media to tell them what they should and shouldn't do. All right. I will say that one of the things that I have found very difficult in the last 24 hours since this started rolling out is white folks sitting behind a computer screen lecturing community organizers in Chicago about how they should act. Nobody knows what's going on in Chicago better than people who live there. And as somebody who has clients in Chicago, friends in Chicago who are organizers, I just want to make it really clear that if you are not on the ground, you are not in a place to tell people what they should and shouldn't do in this environment. Okay. We had 3 court rulings yesterday that were very significant, 2 of which went our way quite substantially, actually, and 1 of which did not. And I'm going to let you guys guess for a minute about why that is. First and foremost, the Fifth Circuit, which is considered to be like the most conservative circuit court of appeals in the country right now, blocked the use of the Alien Enemies Act on appeal to deport Venezuelans to El Salvador. This follows on the heels of an already existing injunction that stopped the invocation of the AEA for the same purpose. There were real questions about whether or not the Fifth Circuit was going to uphold this. That is a 3-judge panel, only one of whom was a Trumper. Now you're starting to see where I'm going with this. The second good ruling came out of the DC Circuit, which reinstated I have to make sure I have this right, an FTC commissioner back into the role that she held after Trump unlawfully tried to fire her. Again, 2-to-1 panel, only 1 Trump appointee, okay? The third case, also out of the DC Circuit, talk about inconsistency, went the opposite way. And essentially it found that an injunction that was holding in abeyance grants for clean energy that the Biden administration had awarded. In other words, Trump had to hold on to that money through the end of the case, lifted the injunction so that that money is no longer preserved. And you guessed it, that panel, unlike the other 2, is 2 Trump appointees to 1. So this is your reminder that when we vote for candidates, especially candidates who are in any way in charge of judicial nominations, there are severe consequences to that, particularly in the federal judiciary where appointments are for life. The Trump appointees to the bench, full stop, are essentially giving Trump carte blanche to do whatever he wants. But when they are up against panels of people who were not appointed by Trump, and that includes, by the way, like Bush appointees or W appointees, right? In some instances, like older appointees that came in under other Republican administrations, those folks are not voting in favor of Trump in large part. They're actually voting in favor of the rule of law. So, one of the things I just want everybody to be like very, very aware of here is that it's very clear that unlike historically, and I've made this point many times before, the judicial appointees who came in under Trump 1 and now under this particular administration are there for one purpose only. And it is just to bend or break the law, the interpretation of the law, so that Trump can do what he wants. It's really not okay. But 2 good decisions at least. And again, I have to point out that in something like 80% of the cases that have currently been brought before the federal courts challenging policies of the regime has lost. And that's good. That's really good. Okay. We had this very strange thing happen yesterday, which is that 11 civilians were murdered on a boat by the Trump regime. And apparently they did it just to have video to put out on their social media feeds immediately thereafter. This is wildly illegal. Like, I can't even tell you, I was watching this when they announced it, and I just thought there's literally no legal basis for them to do this. So what they did was they bombed a boat in international waters that had 11 people on it that they claimed were part of Trendagua, the Venezuelan gang. I'm not pronouncing that correctly. The Venezuelan gang that they have scapegoated, it doesn't even exist anymore, that they have scapegoated for the quote unquote invasion of the United States. Immediately after this was announced, we learned that the boat wasn't even headed for the United States. It was probably bound for Trinidad, and that they suspected, but did not have confirmation, that it was carrying drugs. So essentially what they did in international waters where international law applies, it, without any provocation, without any declaration of war, murdered 11 civilians. That is really, really, really not legal. Now, the question is like, what are the consequences of that? Well, that depends on, one, if Venezuela wants to take any action in relation to it. Two, again, we are not members of the International Criminal Court, which means that technically jurisdiction cannot be exercised over American officials unless they are acting in conspiracy, like El Salvador, with officials from countries that are already a part of the ICC. So there's not likely to be anything that happens there. Could the UN take action? Well, they could declare, there could definitely be a resolution put before the UN Security Council about this. But there's not likely to be any immediate legal consequences. And we have yet to see what Venezuela's response is going to be. So I just don't want anybody to be under the illusion that this is normal. I know that we are very used to, as Americans, unfortunately, our military being used to bomb civilians nonstop. It's like the quality from a military standpoint of my entire adult life. And I'm 54 years old. I feel like that's been happening forever. And simultaneously, there's not even any argument here that there was a provocation or an act of war against the United States. They literally just murdered 11 people so they'd have video for it for social media and could claim that they were being tough. That's about as amoral and illegal as it gets. So, eyes on that, I suppose. Yet another escalation. Somebody gave the direct order for them to murder 11 civilians without any evidence or proof or justification. And I know we've all been kind of keeping our eyes on whether or not the U.S. military would abide by an illegal order. That was an illegal order, and they did it. So that does not, make me terribly optimistic about the state of affairs these days. All right, a little bit of good news. I want you all to get prepared for this. The second nationwide No Kings rally will be on October 18th. Now is the time to start getting organized for this. Again, I want everybody to flag this on their calendars because it's coming. This one is, of course, being co-sponsored by Indivisible, Move On, and others. I also do just want to mention to please stay aware of what's happening in your own local state. For instance, here in New Jersey, there's an effort called Hands Across New Jersey, which is a defensive action that is being taken, I think, a week from Thursday? I can't remember. I think it's a week from Thursday, where literally they're going to line people up hand in hand all the way down the state as a show of protection for immigrants and vulnerable people who live here. So please be aware, because this is the thing. I have to remind everybody: people are taking action everywhere. You're not getting any reporting on this on the mainstream media. But I, by the way, still subscribe to the paper New York Times. They're reporting on the Labor Day protests, which were nationwide. Was the next to the last page of the A section yesterday. Okay. There's not a lot of reporting happening on what's actually going down. And so you have to stay tapped into independent media. You should support independent media. I'm going to remind you guys that you can become paid supporters at patreon.com/resistancelive with 20% off an annual subscription using the code podcast between now and a week from Friday. That's a special promotion because we're going to be loading audio onto podcast platforms, hopefully by the end of this week. But it's really important that you stay supporting independent media, who are also, by the way, covering rallies, protests, and all sorts of efforts right now to interfere with the machinations of the regime. Okay. As with everything else, my suspicion is that the remainder of this week is going to be chaos. I do have to remind everybody that there is this tipping point that happens right around Labor Day, where Congress is back in session. All of a sudden, everything starts to move again. And it definitely feels that way today. So there's going to be a lot of movement on the Hill. Again, we do have another budget event coming up. There are already calls for Democrats to allow the government to be shut down, because you know what happens when you shut down the government? You shut down a lot of the military. That, by the way, will defund the National Guard. So allowing the government at this point to close up shop for a while would not be the end of the world. I'm always thoughtful about my friends who are federal employees when it comes to this, but this particular budget battle is one that I think needs to be leveraged. Not that I have a huge amount of confidence in the senior leadership of the Democratic Party at this point, but shutting down the government would be one way of interfering again with the execution of the worst part of this regime. Final good note that I just want to leave you guys with today, because this is important. ICE is having real recruitment problems right now. There was another demand that went out yesterday for people to register to try to get extra pay, where There were bonuses being offered in exchange for people being rounded up. And I have to remind everybody that they do not have the manpower to carry out the worst of their aims right now. And that alone is a problem. We talked about this here before, but it is really critical to know where recruitment efforts are happening, if they're happening in your state. There's already been some very successful efforts to interfere with ICE recruiting people by protests at sites, at recruitment sites and recruitment events. So there's lots of ways to stay involved in that, but they're having trouble. And I don't think that's a bad thing, because I'm glad to see that a lot of people don't want to be on the wrong side of history. All right, that's it for today, my friends. Quick note to those of you who are in a location that is being threatened with invasion by the National Guard. Please make sure that you take a bystander intervention training online if you are planning on recording anything, because there are things that you could do if you don't know exactly what you're doing that could actually make it worse for vulnerable people. Reminder that Vision Change Win and also Right to Be offer digital bystander intervention training online. There's a lot of those events happening right now. So please make sure that you're doing that kind of a training if you plan on being in the streets and videotaping others. All right. Please like this broadcast, subscribe to this channel. Don't forget to give me a thumbs up. Don't forget to leave me a comment if you're watching on the replay. This is our new time slot, 11 a.m. Eastern, 8 a.m. Pacific. Good to see you. And I will be back here live tomorrow. All right. Take care, everyone. And I will see you then. Bye.